Good afternoon. My paper today is entitled Holiness Restored, Ritual and the Effects of Sin in Ancient Israel. It is evident throughout the Hebrew Bible that ancient Israel believed God is fundamentally holy. Human life is anything but sterile, leading to conditions where people are at odds with that very holiness. Aware of this dichotomy, Levitical literature presented a well-developed system to connect these two incompatible extremes. In order to connect with divinity, humans were repeatedly called to be holy as the Lord is holy. This refrain is repeated with minor variations both in contexts where the Israelites are called to separate themselves from the unclean, as in Leviticus 11:46 and 20:26, as well as places where they are exhorted to live moral and ethical lives, as in Leviticus 9, verse 2 and 20, verse 7. The sanctuary was the focal point for contact between divine holiness and humans who intermittently became ritually impure and periodically acted immoral or unethical. Its services were structured to reconcile these conditions. The conclusion to Numbers 15, a treatise entirely devoted to correct practice related to sanctuary services, enjoins Israelites to wear visible reminders to do all the Lord's commandments and thus be holy to your God. The priestly picture of a holy life grew out of conformity with the correct practice of sanctuary ritual. It is the purpose of this paper to examine the Levitical response to these bipartite effects of fallible human practice, and will therefore limit its focus to the ritual activity performed with the two goats for decisive purification and elimination on the Day of Atonement. This study will first examine the similarities and differences between the two Hatat goats. Second, it will discuss the biblical conception of the effects of sin on human interaction with God. Third, it will scrutinize the function of the Hatat sacrifices outside of the exceptional cases involving the high priest and the Day of Atonement. And finally, it will reflect on the worldview presented in Levitical literature regarding the interface between holiness and fallible humanity. The ritual function of the two goats. The unique function of the Day of Atonement is performed with two goats that are, for ritual purposes, identical enough that before they are differentiated by lot, they are equally qualified for either role. The similarities do not end there. Both are said to atone. Even in the statements that elucidate their function within the ritual, they are both said to interact with rebellions and sins, peshaim and hatot, committed by the Israelites. These two purpose statements in verse 16 of Leviticus 16 and verse 21 of Leviticus 16 are the key, however, to understanding differing function of these goats and warrant a closer examination. Emphasis, repetition as well as syntax. After giving procedural instructions about the goat for the Lord, Leviticus 16:16 enumerates, "Thus he will atone for the holy place from impurities of the Israelites, from their rebellions as well as their sins." Leviticus 16:21 reintroduces the goat for Azazel by stating that he shall confess upon it all the culpabilities of the Israelites, all their rebellions as well as their sins. Three terms appear in both verses, all of which represent categories of human activity that need ritual rectification. With three descriptors in play for each goat, do they serve to reconcile three distinct problems, or are there clues to suggest that their ritual activity is more focused on one of the three items? The answers lie in repetition and syntax. Already the similarities between these purpose statements have been mentioned, but the main difference between them is readily apparent when compared side by side. The first term for each introduces a different category that becomes the focus for atonement. Impurities, tumot, in verse 16 are repeated later in the same verse. Furthermore, only impurities from the altar are mentioned when the summation is stated in verse 19. Likewise, the culpabilities, the avonot, are the only term that are said to be resolved in verse 22 by the goat for Azazel. The content of these verses draws attention to the first item in each purpose statement. The syntax of these enumerations supports the thesis that the first terms are set apart. Each initial category is followed by the qualification of the Israelites. It is also separated by a vav that introduces the second term. If the first term is the primary object of ritual action, then this conjunction could very well be explicative, as I translated above with a colon. This would make the final categories explain the scope of the first. The last item follows lechol, which can serve in Leviticus to introduce the last item in a series, like in Leviticus 11, verse 46. The effect would be the same as the heading of this section in the paper, emphasis, comma, repetition, as well as syntax. If the repetition and syntactical clues indicate this translation is correct. The rebellions, peshaim, and sins, hatot, mentioned in both purpose statements serve to elucidate the scope of the atonement that is achieved by each of the goats, as announced in the sole term mentioned in each summation. The range of meaning for these terms, for peshaim and hatot, then becomes crucial to understand what human activities needed reconciliation between fallible humans and a holy God. Therefore, we will turn next to defining the limits for these two terms. Ritual and rebellion. The word pesha appears only twice in Levitical ritual literature, and both of these are in verses under discussion here. Therefore, to get a sense of this word, usage outside of these contexts will need to be surveyed. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, this word is traditionally translated as transgressions because it indicates the heaviest weight of offensiveness and repercussions among commonly used terms for sin in the Hebrew Bible. The sin of pesha is often referred to as rebelliousness on the analogy of Absalom, who organized an armed rebellion against his father, King David, in 2 Samuel 14. The sin of pesha implies the breaking of a covenanted relationship, as one party pits his will against that of the other. It is used often of nation against nation, and in that context means to cast off allegiance. Jacob Milgram equates pesha in Leviticus 16 with the inexpiable sin committed with the high hand, beyad ramah, in Numbers 15, 30 to 31, that necessitates cutting off, karet, the culprit. The similarity of these terms will be readily apparent. The two occur in the same passage about the rebellion of Jeroboam, who is spoken twice as raising his hand in 1 Kings chapter 11, and the summary result in 1 Kings 12, verse 19 is, "So Israel has been in rebellion, pesha, against the house of David to this day." Rolf Knierim described pesha by saying that it always implies a conscious behavior. The term per se does not describe the attitude of the criminal act that consists in removal of property or breach of relationship. There is much more latitude in the understanding of pesha than in beyad ramah, however. Exodus 22, verse 9 uses the former to describe sins of thieving and defrauding that can simply be resolved in a civil sense with repayment of the property in double. And this verse is one part of a whole passage highlighting sins that are rectified with monetary compensation. In this text, it does not mention any cultic aspects associated with rectifying the wrong, but Leviticus 5, verses 21 to 24 pictures cases of theft and defrauding, which feature an expiatory asham offering alongside the monetary restitution that brings atonement. Thus, the spectrum of pesha sins include at least some cases that may be expiated ritually. Showing that pesha can also be irreconcilable, Exodus 23, verses 20 to 21, presents a case where their peshaim cannot so easily be resolved. Yahweh is sending his angel to keep you in the path, but if you behave bitterly, he will not bear your rebellion. Peshaim. The task of the angel is to lead by keeping them in the path and bringing them to the place he prepared. His job is to shamar, which can indicate both preserving and protecting on that path. Much like the Levitical ritual goal of rectifying sin to restore holiness, this path pictures a positive outcome as the goal which can be defeated by determined rebellion. While some or many pesha sins can be forgiven, there is a point beyond which reconciliation is impossible. From the other end of the comparison, one could say that all beyad ramah sins are pesha to one degree or another, but not all rebellions are high-handed. The sin of pesha is mentioned in the rebellion passage of Numbers 14, but contrary to what one might expect, it does not directly describe the actions of the prominent rebels who ultimately died in the wilderness due to their 40-year punishment. In the scene where the Lord was wrathful toward all Israel, inclined to destroy them all and start over, Moses interceded in chapter 14, verse 18 of Numbers, with the words, "Yahweh is slow to anger, abounding in love, forgiving culpability and rebellion, but will not clear the guilty." Here Moses is quoting God's own promise in verse 17, almost verbatim back at him from his self-declaration in Exodus 34, verse 7, where he described his own inherent character, including that he characteristically forgives peshaim. This is not an obscure, isolated description Moses uses to coax greater forgiveness than usual out of God. This is a fundamental part of Yahweh's stated identity that is so closely tied to his activity in relation to humans that the word pesha appears repeatedly in places like Psalms 32, verse 1. Blessed is the one whose rebellion is forgiven. Psalm 103, 12. As far as the east is from the west, so far he removes our rebellions from us. Isaiah 43, verse 25. It is really I who wipes out your rebellions for my own sake, and I will not remember your sins. Ezekiel 14:11 calls rebels to repent, so the house of Israel will no more stray from me and become unclean through their rebellions and become my people. The other term in this tripartite grouping in the purpose statements of Leviticus 16, verse 16 and 21 is hatot. Hatah is the most common word for sin in the Hebrew Bible. It refers primarily to those who have a target in mind but fail to hit it. This is the word used to describe soldiers in Judges 20, verse 16, who do not miss the mark when hurling projectiles. It is at home in the picture we just saw in Exodus 23, where Israel collectively travels toward a common goal. Hatah represents actions that deviate from a goal, but not necessarily because of any rebelliousness. Unlike peshaim, there are many other places within and outside Leviticus 16 where hatot, or hatat, is used in Levitical ritual contexts. So closely related to its own need for sacrificial expiation, it lends its name to the purification offering, its own remedy. It derives from the PL stem of the word, meaning to undo or unsin. This strong linguistic connection between these sins and the whole conceptual framework of the Levitical sacrificial system helps to underscore that the sins being dealt with on this climactic day respond directly to the sacrifices for sin and impurity throughout the year. Having surveyed the range of meanings for these two terms, they could very well represent the full spectrum of human imperfections needing ritual resolution, from the severest peshaim sins to incidental hatot activities. To understand if these vast conditions could correspond to the focal points of ritual activity, it will be necessary to examine the function of the goats. Impurities and atonement. The summation statement in Leviticus 16, verse 19 declares that the blood of the goat for the Lord will purify the altar and make it holy from impurities of the Israelites. Recognizing the centrality of impurities for the sanctuary services, Jacob Milgram argued that the hatat offerings cleansed from impurity, but because Kippur never takes humans as a direct object, instead always using prepositions like al or be'ad to mean on behalf of, he posited that the object being purified in all cases was not the worshiper, but the sanctuary, which had become defiled by sin or impurity. Because of this emphasis, he called the yearly ritual the Day of Purgations. In this view, everything that occasioned a hatat sacrifice polluted the sanctuary, and the accrual of these, if unresolved ritually, would make the sanctuary unlivable for the divinity, and he would abandon it as pictured in the progression of Ezekiel 9, verse 3, 10, verse 18, and 11, verse 22. Thus, according to Milgram, every hatat sacrifice brought throughout the year, and especially the complex hatat ritual on this climactic day, purified sancta. With such an interpretation, he was forced to admit that the only element left to purge from the sanctuary at this Day of Day of Purgations would be the sins that had not been expiated throughout the year, necessitating his equation of peshaim with sins never allowed expiation, those committed be'ad ramah, resolving the conundrum that a continually purified sanctuary would never need a day of purgations. Roy Gain, through a closer look at the linguistic data, showed that the preposition min is consistently applied in conjunction with kippur to indicate that the person offering the hatat is the one being purged of sin or impurity in every recurring occasion throughout the year, except on the Day of Atonement. Thus, the primary purpose of purification of the hatat sacrifices is established by understanding it as purifying the impure or sinful worshiper who brings the sacrifice throughout the year, and performing the same function directly upon the sanctuary itself once in the year. This makes the most sense of the linguistic data and fits more consistently with the picture of contamination and purging process that Milgram himself posited. The two parts complement one another, and the unique aspects of the ritual can be understood as consequences of its unusually comprehensive goals. The goat for the Lord rectifies the impurity of the sanctuary, and some scholars have sought to extend this action to the ritual of the goat for Azazel. But we have already seen key differences in terminology. The live goat has nothing to do with the sanctuary's impurities, but as the text emphatically and unambiguously states, it deals with the avonot iniquities. The emphasized wording is not the only indication that their rituals are separate and serve different ends. There is no contact or interaction between the slain bull or goat and the live goat to show that the live animal simply continues the same process begun with the high priest's confession on Azazel's goat with them. The high priest's confession on Azazel's goat indicates that there is not a simple transfer by physical contact via the high priest from the slain hatat animals that purged the sanctuary to the live goat. It will clarify our discussion of the fundamental differences between the rituals of the two goats if we next examine the biblical conceptions of the effects of sin and how that illuminates these rituals. Sin, metaphors, and things. It is clear from the foregoing material that in Levitical worldview, when humans sin, impurity results. The idea that wrongdoing creates a stain or dirtiness is pervasive in many cultures, but it is highly developed within biblical ritualistic literature. The champion of this metaphor as a key for understanding the teachings of the Levitical priests was Jacob Milgram, whose general hatat theory systematically interpreted everything by it. At least as vivid as this metaphor in the Hebrew Bible is the conception of sin as a burden. Conveyed most explicitly through the use of the verb nasa, with both avon and hata as objects, it is seldom recognized how pervasive this metaphor is, because it is often rendered in English with other words than bear, such as forgive. These constructions in ritual contexts refer to an objective state created by sinful activity. Consider that a phrase of the type nasa plus avon is a statement that asserts the culpability of the sinner, but which does not elaborate on the practical consequences of the sin, a function taken up, if necessary, by accompanying clauses in the apodosis. To get a handle on this usage, it can be difficult to express it in English. Gary Anderson states, "Committing a serious sin triggers the creation of some sort of thing." Klaus Koch defines the term avon means more than an abstract value judgment, referring rather to an almost thing-like substance. According to one fixed expression, it is present in the perpetrator, indeed even as a self-efficacious combative power that eventually finds the perpetrating subject. Its substantive nature is evident in cases where culpabilities are spoken of as something one can hold in a hand or distance oneself from, as in Job 11, verse 14. Distance from sins, in fact, is connected to forgiveness, as Psalm 103, verse 12 asserts that God will separate them from us as far as the east is from the west, and Micah 7:19 promises that they will be thrown into the depths of the sea, processes that Anderson refers to as removing its thingness. This metaphor involves no more or less than the contemplation of sin as object qua object, such that its external physical character figures into the function of the metaphor. That is, the language of objectification is a strategy for speaking about sin in a way distinct from the person who committed the act, rhetorically isolating it as a potential threat. This objectified state of guilt has other layers as well, for the verb nasa appears in the hifil in Leviticus 22, verses 14 to 16, where an individual is pictured wandering up to the wrong table and eating consecrated food. They must take steps to rectify the problem, or the sin will cause them, the Israelites, to bear culpability and guilt. Thus, corporate culpability and guilt can be caused by individual actions within a group. Ezra 9, verses 6 to 7 provides another picture where corporate culpabilities affect the whole. The word avon seems especially fit to describe the rebellions, peshaim, and sins, hatot, that led to the corporate culpability addressed by the live goat ritual. As mentioned above, nasa is often translated as forgive, because the state of guilt for an unrepentant culprit is only one of three uses of the verb. More commonly, the offended party, usually God, bears the sin and the sinner is forgiven. The other usage is when a third party bears culpability, which only occurs in a paucity of times. When avon is said to be on someone in biblical Hebrew, that is equivalent to a declaration of innocence for those who might otherwise be implicated, as 2 Samuel 14, verse 9 shows, where the woman of Tekoa's statement that the culpability will be on her, Ali ha'avon, is directly linked to David's guiltless throne. Thus it can be seen that the metaphor of bearing sin is at least equally present in the Levitical consciousness as the metaphor for sin creating a stain or impurity. Surely it is no accident that these two prominent metaphors exactly correspond to the key categories that are said to be cleansed, tahar, and born, nasa, out of the camp. We will proceed under the assumption that the goats have distinct functions for cleansing impurity and bearing culpability, respectively. How am I doing on time? Okay. We're going to have to summarize just a little bit. The questions that scholars have pondered for a long time are how do the mechanisms of atonement work in this Day of Atonement? There are a lot of different theories about what happens after the sanctuary is cleansed. The high priest comes out of the sanctuary, and as he comes out of the sanctuary, he lays his hands on the goat, the live goat for Azazel, and confesses the sins of the Israelites on its head. When we look at these metaphors for sin and the effects of sin in Israel, we see clearly that there is impurity being dealt with in the sanctuary precincts, but we also see that there is definitely a sense of we have to distance ourselves from the culpabilities that our sins have created. So in one sense, we have sin as a stain or as impurity, and on the other sense, we have sin as a weight or a culpability or a liability that needs to be dealt with in a physical way. A lot of scholars have come up with interesting ideas about where these culpabilities come from. Baruch Levine used the phrase, the high priest needs to go into the Holy of Holies to be invested with its numinous power so that he can then banish the goat into the wilderness. Other scholars have used terms like picking up the sins from the sanctuary and then putting them on the head of the goat. Some even say that it's almost out of thin air, that as the confession happens with the two hands on the head of the goat, I think David Wright says that they fall on the head of the goat. When we look at this in relation to the patterns of sin in the Hebrew Bible and the metaphors that we have for these culpabilities, the question is, where did these culpabilities reside for the duration of time between when they first were perpetrated and brought to the sanctuary and the time that they are sent off into the wilderness? The answer to this is found in 3 different places. In Leviticus chapter 10, when the 2 sons of Aaron have been slain by holy fire, Moses takes issue with the way that they dealt with the Hatat sacrifice for that holy day, the day of consecration. And he takes issue with the fact that they didn't eat the meat of the sacrifice after the sacrifice had been accomplished. Now, Aaron resolves the doubts in Moses' mind, but in the process, Moses makes the statement that the Hatat sacrifice has been given to you, speaking to the Aaronic priests, has been given to you as a means of bearing, this is Nasa again, the sins of the children of Israel, specifically the Avonot. This harkens back to Exodus chapter 28, where the plate that he was supposed to wear on his crown said holiness to the Lord, that was given to them specifically so that they could bear the sins of the congregation as well. In fact, Numbers 18 says in a couple of different places the same thing. They were to bear the sins of the people. So if we want to picture what's happening to sins, if someone commits a sin, that's going to have at least two byproducts. One, it's going to create impurity. One, it's going to create a liability or a culpability that needs to be dealt with in a physical way. Now, the sanctuary is nowhere in Levitical literature spoken of as bearing culpabilities. This is why scholars are coming up with ideas like investing numinous power and dropping on the head out of thin air of the goat, when clearly the priests were supposed to bear the culpabilities of the people. So when Aaron confesses the sins on the head of the goat, Aaron has been bearing the sins as a mediator for the course of the year until such time as he places them on the head of the goat. Now, the question then is raised, why would we or what exactly is it that he's confessing? What culpabilities are creating this toxic load that's being placed on the scapegoat? As we see in their purpose statements, and as we see in their summary statements, these goats are each dealing with peshaim and hatot. Now, peshaim can be serious rebellious actions. Hatot can be even non-sinful activities, like giving birth, that also require ritual resolution. So, if he's putting peshaim and hatot on the head of the scapegoat, then what about Milgram's thesis that these are the inexpiable sins of the upraised hand? Well, once again, if we fall back on the patterns of sin in the Hebrew Bible, we see that the metaphor is sin needs to be borne by an individual. First, it's borne by the culprit of the sin. Then it is borne by the priest. Then it is borne by the goat for Azazel outside of the camp. Now, there's a problem with this if we interpret these as the high-handed sins, because those were already removed from the camp. The punishment of karet was already enforced on individuals who committed a high-handed sin. In fact, Adrian Schenker has demonstrated that there is a kind of atonement that happens when the culprit of a high-handed sin is excised from the community. So if the need when you commit a sin is to have purification and to have the removal of the culpabilities, then the removal of the culpabilities for all high-handed sins has already taken place. Now, serious sins have still polluted the sanctuary. So certainly the peshaim that are cleansed from the sanctuary are going to include anything that has defiled the sanctuary. But the culpabilities that are placed on the head of the goat are going to be those culpabilities which had been taken to the sanctuary for resolution. The role of the priests. People have shied away from the idea that a priest would bear the sins, bear the culpabilities of individuals throughout the entire year. This is probably why they want to lean toward placing them in the sanctuary. But the whole message of Leviticus chapter 10 is that the priests perform a dangerous job, but they perform it well. Leviticus chapter 10 is where Aaron is spoken directly to by God and invested with the authority to interpret the rites in the sanctuary system. In that sense, you might say that the slogan for the Aaronic priesthood in Leviticus chapter 10 is operating accident-free for 3,742 days and counting, because they do a dangerous job. In fact, the only times in the Pentateuch when God speaks directly to Aaron, normally speaking to Moses, and Moses gives information to other people as he is instructed, the only times when God speaks directly to Aaron is when he is establishing the special prerogatives and responsibilities of the priests, both in Leviticus chapter 10 and in Numbers chapter 18. Now, one thing that Jay Sklar has mentioned in teaching classes is that oftentimes people do not necessarily understand the reason that they do rituals. He'll ask his class, how many of you think that it's a sign of respect in North America for a man to take off his hat when he goes into a church? Everybody pretty much agrees it's a sign of respect. And then he asks them why. And nobody has any clear idea. He's even researched it himself and not found any conclusive answer as to why that is. But people still know what it means. In that sense, a lot of hairs have been split over trying to figure out if the priest eating the meat is actually what physically puts the culpabilities inside of him or not. And if so, what do we do with the meat that they didn't eat in Leviticus chapter 10? Did that invalidate the sacrifice? Aaron, the authority on ritual, says no. But when we look at the broad strokes of how an Israelite approached the sanctuary, the finer details may not necessarily be communicated. If I commit a sin and I take my sacrifice to the sanctuary, I'm going to feel like there's a dirtiness that needs to be cleansed. I'm also going to feel like there's a level of guilt or liability or culpability that needs to be dealt with. And when I see that my sacrifice is brought to the sanctuary and that the blood of that sacrifice is affecting cleansing for my sin, I can see purification happening. In the same way, when I take my offering to the priests and I see those priests then using that as their prebend for performing their ritual function, that may be all the meaning that we need to see in the sanctuary services, the regular Hatat and Asham offerings. The Day of Atonement was a day of unusual comprehensive atonement. Because of this dual approach to dealing with sin. Thank you.